Hello, everyone. Today we'll be discussing section B from paper 2. Our paper 2 is based on research methodology. Now, this particular paper is divided into two different sections, that is section A and section B. Section A is of 46 marks and section B is of 14 marks. Now, for this particular question, what we essentially required to do is design a study or plan a study, where as a student, you're expected to design or think of a proposal based on a particular scenario that would be put in front of you by the examiner. Now, what is it that the examiner tries to assess us on from this particular question? If we have a look at the assessment objectives, our CIE assessment objectives are broadly divided into three categories, that is AO1, AO2, and AO3 respectively. About AO1, AO1 tests our knowledge and understanding. The first assessment objective tests our knowledge and understanding. AO2, that is typically interpretation and application, where the examiner tries to assess how good we are at interpreting and applying the knowledge that we've already gained. And AO3 has to do with analysis and analysis and evaluation. Now, this particular question, the designing a study question, is a question where we plan a study. And this question, when we're planning a study based on the knowledge that we've gained on research methodology or the research methods, we actually end up applying the knowledge. We actually end up applying the knowledge that we've gained from research methodology. And this is the question from where the examiner would actually assess us on a basis of application, on the basis of how good we are in terms of applying the knowledge that we've gained. Now, to begin with, there are a few things that I'd want us all to take a note on. And these points, knowing these points would help you understand this question better. And as we get through these points, we'd move on, and I'd want to discuss two answers to responses that have been published by the CIs, and I'd like to comment on that. Now, to begin with, a few things that have to be kept in mind. Number one, this is a section B question, like I mentioned, and it is worth 14 marks out of 60 marks. 14 marks for both the parts that are divided into 10 and 4, where this 4 again might be divided into two questions of 2 marks each. So this is a section B question, and it's worth 14 marks out of a total of 60 marks for the entire paper. This question makes up about 23% of the total grade, or the total weightage rather, and it is a compulsory question. Now, how does this make up 23%? 14 divided by 60 into 100. This is about 23%, and this is a number that we cannot simply ignore. It's better that we put in a bit of effort, we understand this question, and then, of course, the more you practice, the more you put your pen to paper, the better you'd end up scoring on this. But before we even start practicing, it's pretty important that we understand the requirements of the question, that we understand what this question is all about. Now, moving on, the second point. This question usually relates to a core study from the study, usually not necessarily. If I go a couple of years back, yes, these questions, the designing a study questions, used to revolve around a particular course study. But now that we're aware that our syllabus has changed, this might or might not be the case. Nonetheless, we shouldn't really be worried about this, because if we are good with research methodology and if we've practiced how to apply it, this shouldn't really make any difference. So the examiner wants to see not only if you know your core study, but also if you can use your research skills in a new or a novel situation. Like I had mentioned earlier, the examiner would put up a situation in front of you, and then you'd be expected to come up with a proposal as to how a study could be designed based on that, based on the information that is provided to you about that new or a novel situation. Number three, the examiner will present a scenario with enough of information and then ask a question specifying a research method to use. Now, there are 6 different research methods that I'm sure you're all aware of that are part of a syllabus. To begin with, we have experiments, we have self-report measures that can further be divided into questionnaires and interviews, we have case studies, we have observational methods, we have correlation methods, and a recent addition to all of this is the longitudinal research method as well. So yeah, the examiner will present a scenario with enough of information and then ask a question specifying a research method to use for planning a study. It is not a hard question. At least I believe it is not a hard question, but you need to know the important features of each research method to do well. Now, these important features of research method, we need to know them well, right? And recently the CAI has published these important features as well, which I'd be sharing with you all. That would, I mean, knowing them well and then being able to apply them, or ensuring that you're making them a part of your plan, is what is going to get us marks. I mean, of course, there's a bit more to it as well, but this is a core thing that I'd want everyone to keep in mind and not to miss. I just put an asterisk over here. So yeah, taking this ahead, the fourth point, a recent change in 2024 is that the examiner, through a rubric, now asks not to describe a specific part of the study. So what used to happen was, I mean, if I go back a bit back in time, pre 2018, we did not have lines, specified lines where students were expected to write answers. After 2018, these lines were introduced. And now, after from 2024 onwards, the examiner would specify what the examiner does not want you to. I repeat, the examiner would specify what the examiner does not want you to describe while designing or while planning out that study. Probably because students would, now students being students, they would end up writing whatever they thought was easier. They would end up writing a lot, or they would end up emphasizing a lot more than they should have on certain part of the plan, which now the examiner is trying to ensure that he or she restricts students from. Of course, when you talk about designing a study, the study doesn't always revolve around sampling techniques, and the study doesn't always revolve around ethical guidelines just because you know them better than the other parts of the planning. So yeah, a recent change from 2024 onwards is that the examiner, through a rubric is through an instruction, they would give you an instruction now and ask you not to describe a specific part of the study, not to describe a specific part of the study. This could be so that students focus on other important aspects of the study. Again, while I'll show you a question, this would make more sense to you. Number 5, the question carries 10 marks, like I said. Time management plays a very, very crucial role while you're writing this answer. Remember, like I said, this happens to be the last question when it comes to paper 2. But again, if you remember, what I said was this question again is divided into 2 parts, that is 10 marks and 4 marks. Now, for the 10 mark actual question, actual planning and study question, what typically happens is students tend to be getting carried away. I felt this over years. I'd see students getting carried away, trying to the best of their capacity to come up with a study that is flawless, to come up with a study that is idealistic. And while doing so, they don't even realize that there's a question that they have to attempt after this 10 mark question as well. So let's just say if you think I'd explain this to you through an example over here. Let's just say you feel like you have written a 6 on 10 mark answer, and you're trying your level best to write something more so that you could have additional 2 marks to this, right? That might end up helping you score an 8 on 10. But while doing so, what if you end up not being left with enough of time to attempt the next question, that is a 4 mark question, which God forbid ends up with a 0? So even when you've gained 2 over here, remember, my dear, you'd be losing 4 ahead. So it's better that you go well planned. It's better that you while you're practicing, you time yourself so that tomorrow when you go sit for your CI examinations, this does not turn out to be a problem. So yeah, let's read the 5th point over here. The question carries 10 marks, and it is crucial not to exceed 15 minutes on it. Yeah, not to exceed 15 minutes. Why is it that I say 15 minutes? A simple calculation again. Our CI paper is of 60 marks, where we get 90 minutes. Basic calculation, we get 1.5 minutes per mark. So yeah, for every question you have now, for instance, if this is a 10-mark question, I would not expect you to spend anything more than 15 minutes for this. It is not worth it. So yeah, and yeah, keeping that in mind, you need to make sure that you're done with your section A timely, so that you have enough of time to be able to sit for to be able to attempt the section B, attempt section B well. Remember, section B is of 14 marks, and for 14 marks, again, we would have what do you call it, 5 from there, makes it 15, 15 and 6, 21 minutes. So you should at least have 21, 22 minutes on you to be able to attempt the last question, that is question 10. Getting back to this, question number 5. This question carries 10 marks, and it is crucial not to exceed 15 minutes on it. It's a type of question that can easily consume a lot of time, and you're tasked with proposing a plan or design for a study based on a given situation, right? So one, cater to all the requirements of the question. Number two, keep in mind that the clock's ticking, right? However, it is essential to remember that you have another 4-mark question to answer afterwards, and you need at least 6 minutes for it as well. So keep that in mind, be mindful. The sixth point, approach this task in a well-planned manner. Yes, I'm referring to brainstorming. Brainstorming plays a very important role. I'll explain this ahead, but yeah, simple calculation. If I'm saying this, allocate 15 minutes for this question. Initial 2 minutes, read the question thoroughly. Read it once, read it twice, read it thrice. Mark whatever you think is important. Spend around 3 minutes brainstorming. And if you have it all sketched up in your head, trust me, 10 minutes would be more than enough for you to be able to write an answer to this. So yeah, approach this task in a well-planned manner. Start with brainstorming before you begin. Do ensure you s- so do ensure that you do not skip any steps. I'm sorry, I did not read it correctly the first time. Do ensure that you do not skip any steps. Remember, when you're talking about planning up a study, it has to do with you having, I mean, initially it has to be the aim, the hypothesis, which again you're not really expected to demonstrate, which you're not really expected to write down over here. Then comes your sampling technique, and then comes the research design, the procedure, data analysis, and then the results, right? So broadly, you could divide the plan into these different categories. So make sure you're not skipping on any of the step. Do ensure you don't skip any steps. For example, begin by recruiting the sample before initiating the study, and not the other way around. So this is just an example that I've given you to explain you that if you know what you're expected to do is what is actually expected from you is to think like a tiny little psychologist, right? So if you're actually conducting, think practically. If you're actually conducting the research, these are the steps that you'd be following, right? Now, taking this ahead, the seventh point, propose a practical design and not an idealistic design, right? Again, a common typical mistake that students tend to make is they want their study to be the best. They want their study to be flawless. Mind it, my dear, we have 12 core studies that are part of a syllabus. We and none of them is flawless, right? None of them is flawless. And these have been studies that have been conducted by psychologists who've been in this field for more than what for a couple of decades too. So in that case, if their studies have flaws, if their studies have their weaknesses, it is totally okay for your study to have a few flaws too, right? A few flaws too. Do not do not do not do not do not This does not at all mean that you tend to miss on the essential components of answering, but then again, come up with a plan that is more practical, right? That is more realistic than idealistic. Simple designs contribute to clearer data analysis. Again, data analysis plays a very important role. What students typically tend to do is they tend to collect a lot of data. I mean, they'd be like, oh, I'd collect data through a questionnaire. I might as well use an interview. I'd like to observe as well. Remember, my dear, every data collection technique that you introduce, every data collection technique that you introduce, remember, every sort of data that you're collecting eventually has to be analyzed. If you cannot analyze it well, do not use more than one or more than two data collection techniques, right? So use the data collection techniques, these data collection techniques or multiple data collection techniques only when you can justify them. Now, propose a practical design and not idealistic. Simple designs contribute to clearer data collection or clearer data analysis, I'm sorry. To score in the top band, that is 8 to 10 marks, ensure that your study is replicable. Now, remember, replicable studies are better when it comes to reliability. They stand more of chances when it comes to the reliability of a research. For the ones who aren't really sure about the difference between replication and reliability, a replicable research is a research that can be conducted again in exactly the same manner. However, when we use the term reliability, reliability is a step ahead, and reliability is when you're conducting a research in exactly the same manner and you tend to come up with the same results as well. So remember, if your research is replicable, it would stand better chances of reliability. And how do you make your research replicable? You'd be able to make your research replicable by using standardized procedures. Now, how is it that you'd make your study standardized? You'd be able to make your study standardized by having better controls. So what I've actually said over here is, I just quickly do this, I do not want to get carried away. So better controls lead to standardized procedures. A standardized procedure would lead to better replication of the study, and a better replication of the study would increase the reliability of the research. So yeah, to score in the top band, that is, or the top level, that is 8 to 10 marks, ensure that your study is replicable. Achieve replication through standardized procedures. Now, taking this ahead, moving on to the eighth point. It is important to note that you won't be required to write results or conclusions for this research. It is important, it is pretty important. Do not forget on this. Do not miss out this point. That is point number 8. Uh, yes, many of you probably did not intend to. Nonetheless, we do come across students that end up writing down results. Remember, you are being asked to think of a proposal. You are being asked to suggest a proposal. You are being asked to plan out a study or to design a study. You just required to do the planning part. Because you're not actually conducting the research, where do you think you're coming up with the results from? So because the research is not actually being conducted, there would be no results. And if there would be no results, please do not come up with results. Do not include results or conclusions in your study. Now, the eighth point, it is important to note that you won't be required to write results or conclusions for this question. The ninth point, thorough data analysis is crucial, right? With this point, this ninth point, I discuss this further when we'd be discussing the specimen response. But yeah, thorough data analysis is crucial, and achieving clarity in your analysis is necessary to secure a high score. So what many students tend to do is tend to they tend to bring in stuff from here, there, and everywhere, and then just leave it there. Don't do that. If you plan on, like I mentioned earlier, if you plan on collecting data through multiple data collection techniques, ensure that you're being very clear about how that data that is being collected would eventually be put to use, right? Now, the next one, the 10th point, it is important to not overly complicate your data collection techniques. Simply employing multiple methods isn't enough. For each type of data collected, you must justify its use by demonstrating to the examiner how you're applying the gathered data in your analysis. Now, this is a point that I've been talking about earlier as well. The 11th point, the subsequent or the following IFOMA question that follows the designing or planning question may be split into two parts, like I mentioned. This question generally revolves around the features you've chosen for your study and their evaluation. So what you've already chosen, what you've already used, you'd probably have to the following 4-mark question would be related to it. Now, another 2 points that you see over here written, messed up writing. Not every question. Yeah, another important thing, another very important thing. Many students end up using an experiment when they're asked to design a study. Use an experiment when only when you're required to use an experiment. You use an experiment to test something, to test a hypothesis, right? And just because you've asked to design a study does not at all mean you'd end up using an experiment. I'm not saying do not use it even when the examiner asks you to use it. You do use it when the examiner is asking you to use it. But if the examiner is not asking you to use it, or when the examiner is not explicitly mentioning it, you better make a point that you think twice before you end up using an experiment. And unnecessary independent and dependent variables have been found in many scripts when we going through these scripts while checking your papers. The 13th point, expect around 30 lines to be able to write. So this is a 10-mark question. Typically, if we speak about other questions in paper 1 and paper 2 both, except the paper 1 last question, that is the evaluative question. So what happens is in typically in your papers for a 2-mark question, you would get 4 lines. For a 3-mark question, you'd get 6 lines. For a 4-mark question, you'd get 8 lines, so on and so forth. But for this 10-mark question, instead of getting 20 lines, you should expect to get around 30 lines. And I think is enough for you. I wouldn't say that's more than enough, but I believe it is enough for you to come up with a study. Because remember, you could keep on adding more and more of details, but adding more of details and repeating would end up taking a lot of time too. And we do not have an entire day to us. Remember, when you sit for examination, it is not only about your knowledge being tested, your knowledge gets tested, your application gets tested specifically from this question, and the extent to which you are able to keep in mind the amount of time you have, you be able to keep or maintain control over your nerves, that counts too. So remember, time management plays a very, very important role for this question. Now, without any further ado, I'd like to begin. Now, what exactly do you see on this slide right now? This is been published by the Cambridge International ASN A-Level Psychology 9990 syllabus for 2024, 2025, and 2026. Here you go. Planning studies for paper 2. This is what planning studies to indicate general features. Number 1, when you're planning a study, it has to have the procedure, how the plan makes the study valid, how the plan makes the study reliable, and the type of data that you collect. Now, these are essential features or generic features that are to be kept in mind. Plan studies using specific research methods to include required features. Now, see this part, the top part that I just showed you, this is there. This is something that has to be kept in mind for any question, any designing a study or planning a question that you get, right? But nonetheless, remember when I said the examiner would typically require you or would typically mention a particular research method that you'd be expected to use while designing a study. Now, these research methods, now where did I pick this up from? This is available on your in your syllabus. You just need to be mindful and read through your syllabus carefully. Why is it that I'm mentioning this over here? Because this is legit information that has been published by the Cambridge. I want you to take this bit seriously as well. And these are the features that the examiner wants you to know and to demonstrate while writing your answer. So we have experiments, the first research method, followed by self-report measures. You might as well pause this video over here, copy down these points, because these are the points that would be used ahead. Number 3, for case studies, these are the points. For observational studies, this is what it is. For correlational studies, and this is for longitudinal researches. Now, this longitudinal research has been a recent addition, and you would be tested for the first time from 2024 onwards. Now, before we proceed, 2 more points that have to be kept in mind. And the first one that I'd mentioned earlier as well, candidates will not be expected to include aim or hypothesis in their plan. So you're not expected to write down the aim or hypothesis in your plan. You're not expected. One. Number two, candidates will not be expected to evaluate issues related to the sample generalizability or ethics of the plan. So this is what I was talking about. You're not expected to, right? Here you go. Now, I hope this makes sense. Moving on, this is the question. So what I plan, the plan over here that I'd like to follow, or at least I try to follow, is to walk you through what the basic requirements are. I mean, there were initially I started off with a couple of points that I felt are pretty important for every student to know before you start planning, well, before you start planning a study, or before you start even learning how to attempt this question that requires you to plan a study. Number two, these were the essential features that I just showed you all. Now, moving on, if we speak about the specimen paper, now the specimen paper, in the specimen paper, we had this question that said, Dr. Felix, now, before I proceed, I'd like to zoom this and I'd want all of you to focus on this while you read this, right? Let me just put it into a red box. Oops, that did not really work out well for me. I hope this would. So yeah, I think it's better now. So read the question thoroughly, read the question thoroughly, read the question multiple times. Almost 2 decades now of teaching, but trust me, every time I come across a question, I read it multiple times. So I'd expect that from you as well. Now, taking this ahead, Dr. Felix believes that adults between the ages of 55 and 65 cope less well with their jobs. Now, while you're reading, try to absorb the information, try to pick on the important points that you have in this in the question, right? Now, in the scenario, first we read through the scenario and then we move on to the question. Remember, every single word has to be taken seriously over here. So we're talking about Dr. Felix. Yes, this doctor with the name Felix. She believes that adults between the ages of 55 and 65. So we're talking about a study, we're talking about a situation where we have a doctor, that is Dr. Felix, and she believes that adults between the ages of 55 and 65 cope less well with their job. They cope less well with their job, regardless of whether they stay in the same job or change jobs. Now, there are two important pieces of information that we have over here. And trust me, while discussing this, I've come across 90% of students missing on this, right? They just read the first part, the part that I've highlighted over here in yellow, and miss on the part that has been highlighted in green over here. Now that because it's highlighted, you probably did not miss on it, but again, I would advise you to read your questions thoroughly. So, Dr. Felix believes that adults between the ages of 55 and 65 cope less well with their jobs. One, regardless of whether they stay in their same job or change jobs. Full stop. Taking it ahead, Dr. Felix plans to use a sample of adults aged 55 at the beginning of the study. So Dr. Felix, now what she's planning on to do is, number one, we spoke about what she believes in, right? Number two, we're talking about what her plan is. Now, Dr. Felix plans to use a sample of adults aged 55 at the beginning of the study. Full stop. So we are not we, Dr. Felix. Dr. Felix plans on conducting a research or a study where her sample would comprise of individuals who are aged 55 and above. No, who are actually aged 55. Now, taking this ahead, she will recontact the participants by telephone, right? That's additional information that we have. Remember when I said every word over here has to be taken seriously, right? She will recontact the participants by telephone as she has a record of each individual's telephone number and will be following appropriate ethical guidelines. So we understood the first part, we understood the second part, the third part over here. She will recontact the participants. Of course, if you're talking about individuals who are 55, what I understand so far is probably these individuals would be contacted again. So to be able to recontact these participants, that is Dr. Felix, she plans on using their telephone. She plans on using telephone to recontact them. And she'd be able to recontact them because she has a record of individuals' telephone numbers. Number four. Number five, and she will be following appropriate ethical guidelines. So, one, we spoke about what Dr. Felix believed in. Number two, we spoke about what she planned on doing. Number three, we spoke about the sample that she plans on collecting data from. Number four, we spoke about how she planned on contacting those participants and how is it that it was possible because she had record of their telephone numbers. Number five, we are being told by the examiner that Dr. Felix plans on using appropriate ethical guidelines. And taking this ahead now, moving on to the question. Let's have a look at what the question is now. So this is the information, this is the scenario that the examiner provided us. And now we move on reading the question. Describe how Dr. Felix could conduct a longitudinal study. Here you go. This is the research method that the examiner is expecting you to use while suggesting a proposal for Dr. Felix, right? So for us to be able to attempt this question, remember our grip on research methodology is pretty important. Number one, what is a longitudinal research? A longitudinal research is a research that is conducted over a period of time, over a long period of time, provided there are developmental changes recorded, right? A longitudinal research is a research that is conducted for a long and extended period of time. Now, the term long and extended period of time over here is pretty subjective, provided there are developmental changes that are being recorded. So there are two essential components of a longitudinal study for now that we need to consider. Now, moving on to the question again, the question says, describe how Dr. Felix could conduct a longitudinal study to investigate how well adults between the age of 55 and 65 cope with their jobs. So the question is, describe how Dr. Felix could conduct a longitudinal study. What for? To investigate. What to investigate? She wanted to investigate it. She wanted to investigate how well adults between the ages of 55 and 65 cope with their jobs. Now, moving on, the rubric or the instruction or the additional information that has been provided by the examiner to us is do not describe how Dr. Felix would recontact her participants. Number one, do not miss on this piece of information. The sample or the sampling technique or ethical issues or guidelines in your answer. So the examiner has tried to give us clear-cut instructions as to not end up spending time describing how she recontacted her participants, how she collected her sample or the sampling technique that she used, or the ethical guidelines that she would be following. These are the three things that we are expected to stay away from. Moving on. Now, use the table below to mark candidates' responses to this question. Now, what table are we talking about? This is the table we're talking about. So, of course, as a student, you would always want to score in the top level of the top band. That is a 9 to 10 mark level or band, the top band over here. And if you're expecting to score anywhere between 9 to 10 marks, number one, you should be able to describe all the required features, Remember, these are the required features that I had asked you all to maybe pause and copy and then learn how to apply. So these are the features. If you did not do that earlier, you might as well do it right away. So here you go. Yeah. Now, so the response, describe all the required features, all explicit and with detail, right? You are expected to describe all the required features, all features to be described in an explicit manner with detail, with mostly appropriate terminology. One. Number two, clearly apply knowledge of methodology involved in planning and investigation. So in other words, flaunt your knowledge that you've gained through research methods. So whatever you know about research methodology, whatever is appropriate for this particular investigation in this particular scenario, put it to use. Do not hesitate. Do it in an explicit manner, providing a lot of details as well. While doing so, remember the clock's ticking. All you get is 15 minutes eventually. Of course, while we'll be discussing this, many of you would probably be like, hey, that's quite a lot. That's quite a lot that's being expected from us. But remember, if you plan on scoring high, if you plan on scoring in the top band, I'm not talking about if you wish, everyone would wish, right? But if you actually want to score high, you'd have to start putting your pen to paper. You'd have to start practicing, but practice after you've understood it well. I'm doing the explaining part. You're supposed to understand it, and then you practice all you want, and hopefully you'd be able to score well. So yeah, moving on. Use the description below to mark candidates' response to this question. There are 4 essential requirements for a longitudinal study, and let's discuss them one by one over here. The first essential feature for a longitudinal study over here. Remember, we're talking about a study where Dr. Felix is wanting to investigate if individuals are able to cope up less between the age 55 to 65. Now that it is clearer, it is a longitudinal study, so probably or perhaps the course of action that should be taken is to collect data over a number of years. So probably start collecting data like the question suggested, like the scenario suggested, from the age of 55, and then 55, and then 56, and then 57, and 58, and 59, all the way till 65. So yeah, the first essential feature of a longitudinal study: tests or tasks. The measures that you're using to collect data. Now, like I had initially warned, do not end up falling a trap, do not end up being trapped with experiments. It's not that I dislike experiments, I like experiments, but I've seen a lot of students using experiments unnecessarily. So yeah, refrain from that. So number one, the tasks or the tests that you'd use to collect data. Now, out of the 6 research methods that are part of our syllabus, I'll just quickly write it over here to remind you. Out of the 6 research methods that I mentioned a minute back that are part of our syllabus, we have experiments, and then we have self-report measures, and then we have case studies, we have observation, we have correlational studies, and we have longitudinal research. That's an L, right? So and then again, self-report measures could be further divided into questionnaires and interviews. So we have 6 research methods, right? Now, I have a reason why I'm doing this, so that I could explain something to you. Well, many of you would know, many won't. So it's better that things are clearer. Now, out of these 6 different research methods that we have, there are only interviews, questionnaires, and observation. So out of these 6 research methods, we have interviews, questionnaires that are collectively referred to as the self-report measure, as well as observations. Out of these 6, you only have 2 of data collection techniques. So observation is the data collection technique. Questionnaire, using a questionnaire, is the data collection technique. Using an interview is a data collection technique. Now, why is it that I'm using the word a data collection technique? Because remember, when you're conducting a research or an observation, when you are observing someone, you're collecting data. Remember, when you're questioning someone, when you're interviewing someone, you're collecting data again. Remember, if you plan on distributing questionnaires, you're again collecting information. So besides observation, questionnaires, or interviews, any other research method that the examiner requires you to put to use, you would have to, I repeat, you would have to use external data collection techniques. That might as well be an observation, might as well be a questionnaire or an interview, or any other data or any other test that helps you gather data. So what do we understand from this first point over here? Spade's getting messy. Let me just clean it up. So yeah, the first point, the tests or the tasks, the measures that are being used, right? The description of tasks, whatever the task is that you have in your mind, describe it with detail. Remember, the exam, remember the table that I showed you beneath, it had the word explicit, it had the word detail. Description of tasks in an explicit and a detailed manner is essential. Could be any task, could be any test, could be any sort of questions that are being used as well. And of course, if you're using questionnaires, you'll have to give examples. Now, this would I'd explain this to you while I'd be explaining the response for the specimen question paper to you. Number two, scoring. Scoring should not be ignored either. How the tasks, the tests, or the questions will be scored. Remember the point that I kept on talking about a while back. Students would use this, they'd use that, they'd use multiple methods to collect data. How do you plan on scoring it? You ought to come up with a way. You ought to be clear about what your intentions are as to how you'd score or as to how you would analyze the data that you've collected. Now, this could be possibly done through rating, through adding up totals, through interpretation of qualitative data, by comparing scores on the same tests over time, such as with averages, so on and so forth. I hope that makes sense. Moving to the third part. Now, the second part has to do with data analysis, if I sum it up in 2 words. Number three, frequency or the interval. Remember, this is a longitudinal research. And as we speak about a longitudinal research, you collect data you collect data in intervals, right? For instance, if we're collecting data from individuals from the age 55 to 65, what do you have in your mind? Do you plan on meeting them, or do you plan on collecting data every 6 months, or do you plan on collecting data every year? Or could be anything else. Make sure you come up with a plan, you come up with a concrete plan, right? So frequent or intervals, patterns of testing over time. What is the frequency with which you would be collecting data? Like I said, an example could be 6 months, an example could be 3 months, every 3 months, every 6 months, every year. Staffing, you're probably not alone. You require more of people to collect data, right? And of course, while planning, or while proposing or suggesting a plan, you ought to keep in mind that you should have people, or at least you should aim to have people with you in your team that would spend, or that would show willingness towards collecting data through and throughout the research period. Because especially when you talk about qualitative data, analysis of qualitative data, uh, it's not as easy as analysis of quantitative data. So if you have the same people with you throughout the research period, it would get easier for you to maintain standardization. So yeah, frequency we've spoken about, staffing we've spoken about, reuse of the tasks or the tests, whatever the ways through which you're collecting data, would you keep on reusing that? Now, note, an experiment is not acceptable. I'm glad the examiners have mentioned this here. An experiment is not acceptable. They cannot just be repeated, i.e., cannot just be repeated measures designed with one test and one retest of a single measure of a dependent variable. That explains it well enough. The next point, make sure you are using controls. You have enough of control employed in your investigation that helps you standardize your procedure. And if you're able to standardize your procedure, you would be able to replicate your study. And if you're able to replicate your study, the chances of higher reliability are always there. So controls of standardization, ways to maintain parity across testing intervals. Now, this was the specific question. This was the scenario. This was the question. We had spoken about the generic marking bands or the levels, and now we've spoken about the requirements of a longitudinal study, right? This is how you'd be graded. You might as well read the fifth, fourth, and the third level, all three, so that you could be able to distinguish or differentiate. Something important that has to be noted. Remember, information about recontacting of participants for repeated testing, example, participants tracking, ethical record maintenance, participants, same group, large group, not necessarily all participants every time, is already provided, so cannot earn credit. Now, the examiner is being very clear about what the plan is. If you've been asked not to use it, you should not use it, because you would not gain credit out of it, because you would not gain marks out of it. A frequently asked question at this point is, Sir, what if we do? Will that result in deduction of marks? No, CI does not have negative marking. No one's going to take away marks from you. Nonetheless, remember those 90 minutes, every single minute counts. If they're asking you if they're asking you not to do it, you shouldn't do it. And when I said read the question thoroughly, if you've read the question thoroughly, you would not make such a mistake. Nonetheless, if that does happen, no one's going to take away marks from you. So we just spoke about the question that we have in the specimen paper for 2024, 2024, 2025, respectively. This is the same case that we just read off, the first essential point, the second essential point. This is the question. I'd like to read out the question. Again, the question says, describe how Dr. Felix could conduct a longitudinal study to investigate how well adults between the ages of 55 and 65, I'm talking about this part, just highlight it. Adults between the ages of 55 and 65 cope with their jobs. So the additional part as well, do not describe how Dr. Felix would recontact a participant's sampling technique, or ethical issues guidelines in your answer. To begin with the specimen response. Yes, this might look a little dirty to you all, but all of the extra information that I've added to this has a purpose. To begin with, now what answer is this? Where did I get it from? Why is it that we have it over here? And how could we put this to use? So what is this answer? Number one, after every few years, especially when there's a change in the syllabus or the paper structure, the CAIE publishes a document through which they try to demonstrate different type of responses. This is typically we've always had three different type of responses: a high-end answer, a mediocre answer, and a low-band answer. So in this year, the examiners or the CIE decided to just publish two of them: the high-end answer, where the high-end answer, and this is that high-end answer that you have in front of you, and then there's a middle grade answer as well. So we're starting off with this high grade answer, and yeah, we're starting off with this high grade answer, and let's see what you understand from this. Remember, I hope you remember the question. If you don't, uh go back, read the question, and then come back again. So yeah, assuming you know the question and you know the question well, let's begin. Dr. Felix must plan to collect data at regular intervals. Now, Dr. Felix must plan to collect data at regular intervals. By using this term, regular intervals over here, you're showing the examiner that you know that it is an essential feature, of longitudinal researches, that the researcher collects data at regular intervals, right? So Dr. Felix must plan to collect data at regular intervals from age 55. That reflects that you've understood, that you've read your question well, that you've understood your question well, and you're showing the examiner that data has to be collected at regular intervals, and this data collection would start at the age of 55. The participants, when they are of 55 years. She could contact her participants by email in January every year. Now, she could contact her participants by email. So there's a boo-boo. Not that the examiner would deduct marks for this, not that, but at the same time, you're not getting credit for this. Remember, the examiner had specified that you're not supposed to describe how the participants were being recontacted. And if you remember, it was very specifically mentioned that the participants would be recontacted through telephone. So she could contact her participants by email. Let's ignore it for now. In January every year, look at the detail. In January every year, make it sound realistic. Make it sound like you are serious about your business. Make it sound like you actually plan on conducting a research in reality. So a legit plan, this is how a legit plan looks like, right? Not that this particular response does not have flaws. I believe it does, more than it should have, but nonetheless, good should be given a due credit. So she could contact her participants by email in January every year until they're 65. Very good, right? So 11 times in total. Now, recently I was teaching, I was explaining this at uh to a bunch of students, to a particular batch, and those kids, they was like, oh sir, does the examiner expect us to spoon feed him? I'd say maybe yes, do it, right? If that's helping you gain marks, do it, right? So she could contact her participants by email in January every year until they're 65. So 11 times in total. Each year, she will use the same questionnaire. Does that click? Does that remind you that a standardized procedure is being used? Remember, an essential feature of of responses that would score in the top level. So each year she will use the same questionnaires. It will be online so that she can access all the same people even if they moved around. That's again, she's being more realistic and practical. I mean, this proposal. So we're not talking about contacting them by email. They, let's just say you call them and you're like, hey, could you please fill out this questionnaire? We're sending you a link on your contact number, anything, right? So it would be online so that she can access all the people even if they move around. Full stop. Her questionnaire needs to have questions about coping, one, and whether they have changed their jobs. Remember when we were reading the scenario, the novel situation, I had shown you by highlighting those two different parts in yellow and green, if I'm not mistaken. So yeah, uh, so that she can access all the people even if they move around. Her questionnaire needs to have questions about coping and whether they have changed their jobs. So you're catering to both parts of the for both parts of the information that was provided to you. She also needs a way to know who is who by giving them a number so she can track individual changes. Does that remind you of the ethical guideline confidentiality being put to use? See, in defense of this particular response, you did not describe any ethical guideline. You just showed the examiner that you are mindful about the idea that when participants are to be recontacted, it's a better way to go about with it is for a better way to go about with it is to allocate a number to them. And I mean, you typically do that so that their personal information is not compromised. If you still don't get this, remember the CAIE allocates a candidate number to you. So if you've understood that, you should understand this as well. So yeah, she also needs a way to know who is who by giving them a number so she can track individual changes. Another important feature of a longitudinal study, being able to track individual changes. Remember when I was defining a longitudinal study, or when I was trying to explain it to you in a simplistic form, what I had said was a longitudinal study is a study that is conducted for a long and extended period of time, provided there are developmental changes that are recorded. Or so, like this says, so that she can track individual changes. The first paragraph ends here. Moving on to the second one. Her first question now, remember the task, the measure, whatever the task or the measure that you plan on using. Remember, you need to be, you need to provide details, you need to be descriptive, you need to explicitly tell the examiner what you have in your mind. So her first question will be how old you are, which they answer in months and years. Remember, look at the details, right? So, I mean, not that this isn't something that you cannot do. Of course, you can do this. You just need to be mindful and you just need to practice a lot. If you're mindful, if you have all of these features in your mind, and if you know what is required and then you're practicing well, there's no reason for you to not be able to score well. So, if you are looking forward towards a good grade, you might as well put in effort. Her first question will be, how old are you? Which they answer in months and years detail. This is a closed question. Now, by mentioning this part, which they answer in months and detail, see you providing you being very clear about what your intentions are. This is a closed question. Very good. You're again flaunting your grip on research methodology, right? So, how old are you? Question mark. Years or months? Question mark again or dash. Then there will be a set of closed questions about the job. Are you in the same job as last year? Remember, the scenario had to do with the difference changing jobs could make in terms of coping as well, right? So, are you in the same job as last year? This is an example of closed question. At this point, many students would be like, hey, do we have to give these examples? Of course you do. You have to give these examples so that you're able to show the examiner that you've successfully applied the knowledge that you had gained earlier while studying research methodology. So yeah, are you in the same job as last job? Sorry, are you in the same job as last year? Yes or no? If no, is the new job in a similar career? Yes and no again. Is the new job a promotion? Question mark, yes and no again. Is the new job similar hours? Question mark, more slash the same slash less. Now, these are all examples of closed-ended questions that the let's just say the student had mentioned earlier. So pretty detailed examples of what sort of questions you'd ask, and through these questions what sort of information that you plan on gaining from these questions. Of course, the information that you would gain out of these questions is eventually help you come up to a conclusion in terms of whatever you were investigating. Now, the main part of the questions will be about coping. The main part of the questionnaire, sorry, will be about coping. Moving on, the participants are given instructions. Very good again. The participants are being given instructions. Participants have been given instructions. Like I'd mentioned earlier, think like a tiny psychologist. For a bit, think like you actually are conducting this research. When you are collecting information through a questionnaire, or be it any other mean, remember it's pretty essential that you give instructions, like just like the way the CI does give you instructions, right? And these instructions have to be taken seriously. So the participants are given instructions with the questionnaire telling them to spend no more than 15 minutes. Now, again, you're giving specific details. You're making it sound like you are there and conducting this research for real. So the participants are given instructions with the questionnaire telling them to spend no more than 15 minutes answering the questions. When Dr. Felix and a colleague analyze the answers, wait, did this response mention a colleague? If you've picked this, or if you've noted this, remember having a colleague would help you with inter-rater reliability. Having a colleague would help you recheck the data that you've gathered, which again would help you in terms of analysis, which again would help you in terms of increasing the credibility of your research. So Dr. Felix and a colleague. So now we're talking about another person being there as well, and an independent coder helps with inter-rater reliability. For the ones who do not recall what inter-rater reliability is, when the same thing is being rated by two different people at least, and they both come up with the same conclusion, you could conclude that the findings are high in terms of inter-rater reliability. So yeah, when Dr. Felix and a colleague analyze the answer, they will use a set of definitions to help them to be consistent. Set of definitions. Very good. This again reminds me of how well operationalization has been used over here. Operationalization of data, or in other words, defining your data, right? You're setting rules, you're setting guidelines, just like the CI does. I don't know why I have been giving a lot of examples, a lot of CI examples, but then again, the CI has operationalized, the CI operationalizes grades too. The CIs, if you've ever had a look at grade threshold, the CI would be like, hey, if you've scored anything between this and this is a grade you'd receive. If you've scored anything between this and this is a grade you'd receive, so on and so forth, right? So Yeah, when Dr. Felix and a colleague analyze the answers, they will use a set of definitions to help them be consistent. Now, interpretation of data, especially qualitative data, the qualitative descriptive responses that you receive need to be analyzed in a consistent manner. Just a couple of minutes back, I had shown you that the Cambridge had operationalized what a level 5 answer would be like. They had defined what a level 5 answer would be like. For anyone to be able to score anywhere between 9 to 10 marks, that was the essential requirement. So you need to have the same set of definitions so that there's consistency found in the way you're analyzing your data. Now, Dr. Felix and a colleague analyze the answers. They will use a set of definitions to help them to be consistent. Taking it ahead, she should aim to work with the same colleague each year to standardize the way they analyze the answers to the open questions. Remember, this is something that I mentioned earlier on as well. We're talking about a longitudinal study. We're talking about a study that would that would go for about around a decade, right? So you ought to have the same colleague with you, or you could at least aim to have the same colleague with you, right? So uh, for example, to interpret a question asking, no, wait, what did I miss? The same colleague each year to standardize the way they analyze the answers to the open questions. For example, to interpret a question asking, describe a situation at work you coped with well. Now, this is an example of a qualitative data. This is a question that could help you gather qualitative data. And like I had mentioned a couple of minutes earlier, specifically for qualitative data, you ought to have, I mean, it's, remember when I said it's easier to interpret or to give meaning to quantitative data than it is to give meaning to qualitative data. So especially when you're talking about collecting qualitative data, which can be demonstrated through this. You describe a situation. When you're describing a situation at work you coped with well, you should have you should have definitions that are same, so that both the coders, or both the colleagues give the same meaning to what has been written. So yeah, describe a situation at work you coped with well. There could be lots of possible answers to this, right? There could be lots of possible answers. So they could have a list of positive words such as effective, friendly, productive, while describing your situation. If the respondents, while describing the situation, if the respondents end up using words such as effective, friendly, and productive to look for in the response. Another question could ask, other if you find any other employees difficult to work with, explain why. This is again an example of a question that shows that qualitative data is being gathered as well. There could be closed questions on this questionnaire too, such as rate how well you feel you're coping at work. Now, I mean, for this rating part, ideally there should have been a rating scale over here, preferably what do you call it, a liquor type scale would have been amazing. So it is important when the data is being analyzed to consider whether if an individual participant is coping less well. This is because they're older than last time. Another important point, right? So we're talking about participants who aging every year. I know everyone ages every year. As long as you're alive, you keep on aging. So but for now, we're talking about participants from whom you started collecting data when they turned 55. So we're talking about not very young people who'd keep on aging. So a participant is coping less well. This is because they're older than last time, or because they have changed their job and the new job is harder to cope with. The findings from these questions can be compared with quantitative answers to the question about how hard their job is. Again, we're talking about data being collected through quantitative means. I mean, quantitative data being collected and qualitative data being collected as well. And then this data being compared. Not only is it about comparison, but at the same time, look at this part as well. So questions can be compared with the quantitative answers to the questions about how hard their job is, which can just be totaled up as 2, 1, or 0. So the scoring part again, and an average calculated for each year group. Example, as same job is easier to cope with, that's 2. If the new job is similar, that's one, as it's harder to cope, but not as hard as it's different, which scores 0. Do you see the detail in terms of how this data is being analyzed? You're telling the examiner, you're very clearly showing the examiner that you know your business. You're showing the examiner what you actually meant when it came to data analysis. You collected quantitative data, you collected qualitative data, and then you spoke about how you would score them, right? Now, this is a piece of additional information, additional suggestion, I'd rather say. Also, they may have other issues in their lives that make it harder for them to cope with their job, such as having children or death. The questioner should ask about these as well. So yeah, uh, this response contains this part that I've marked over here in purple. I don't think this was required because the question did not demand this. Nonetheless, the examiner thinks it's a good idea, but I think if you bring in more of clarity or description in terms of what the essential requirement of the question is, that would help you better instead of you introducing something that you would not ask for. Nonetheless, good attempt. So in this particular question, the the score the received to this response was 9 out of 10. Now I'd like to discuss why the examiner feels or felt that this particular answer should receive a 9 on 10. Now, to begin with, if we speak about examiner comments over here, the 10 mark question, the 10 mark questions using a level based marking scheme. Now, a level based marking scheme, what does this mean when they say a level based marking scheme? These are the levels we're talking about. And this is something I showed you before as well. If you did not note this earlier, you might as well take a screenshot right away, or you could note this down as well. I just read this quickly for you as well. This says describes an answer that describes all the required features. One, all explicit with detail with mostly appropriate terminology. An answer that clearly applies knowledge of methodology involving in planning an investigation. This is what this answer did have according to the examiner. Taking this ahead. So the examiner comments over here read, the 10 mark questions are marked using a level-based mark scheme. It is worth noting the focus on required features. Now, what sort of required features are we talking about? These were the required features that I'd shown you. These required features for an experiment, required features for a self-report measure, required features for a case study, required features for an observational study, required features for a correlational study, and a longitudinal study. So taking this ahead, the 10 mark questions are marked using a level-based mark scheme. It is worth noting the focus on required features. These features for each type of study that is an experiment observation are listed in the Cambridge International ASNA level 9990 syllabus. This is something I mentioned right at the beginning too. This is a very good answer, which I believe it is. Tackling each of the 4 required elements in detail. Yes, there was a lot of detail that was over here as well. Now, if you see, I have certain points marked over here. The reason why I've marked this is because I would want you all to check for yourself, especially when we reach to these specific points, so that you know, I mean, these are the points that I specifically want you guys to keep in mind. So the third point over here, the task is clearly a questionnaire. So the task that is, or the testing measure, or the data collection technique used by this particular response or by this particular student is a questionnaire very clearly. In 2 parts, one about the job and one about coping. At the end, the candidate adds a further idea about other factors about coping, which is also relevant to this. The details of the task are also good, right? It is identified as an online questionnaire with open and closed questions, and appropriate examples are of each are given. So you've identified, like, remember when I said you have flaunted over your knowledge on research methodology, you have identified it well, you have given appropriate examples, you have covered both of the key ideas of the job as well as coping. Moving on, the suggested questions about other factors affecting coping mentioned at the end could have included more details or examples. Like it said, I mean, you first get done with what you're supposed to get done with, and then you get into then you try involving other things that you haven't really been asked for. So, like I said, the suggested questions and other factors affecting coping mentioned at the end could have included more details or examples. And the question now, rate how well you, the question, rate how well you feel you are coping at work, needed a scale example from 0 to 10. This is something that I believe, mentioned over here as well. See, rate how well you feel you're coping at work. This is, if you remember when I said the additionally, there should have been a liquor type scale where probably you could have said this is a scale from 0 to 5, where 0 means this and 5 means this. Make sure you're specifying that 0 means this, 5 means this. This is just an example I'm giving you. So at this point, there are many students would be like, hey, do they look into this many details? This is why exactly I'm showing this to you, a Cambridge published document, so that you know all of this is taken seriously. So, where was I? Yeah, rate how well you feel you're coping at work, needed a scale from 0 to 10, where 0 is not coping at all and 10 is coping perfectly. Next, 6 points. Scoring is also tackled well with good information about analysis of the open questions and about totaling and averaging the quantitative data. So scoring is also tackled well with good information about analysis on the open questions. Remember, you had suggested there would be another colleague, and then you'd have consistency over your analysis. How would you have consistency? You'd be able to have consistency by having predefined or operationalized meanings given to words, and then there were specific words that were exemplified over there as well. So scoring is also tackled well with good information about analysis of the open questions and about totaling and averaging the quantitative data. Some further details of the quantitative data would have been useful, especially as the scoring for the rating scale was absent. So how much is enough to be seeing it to be enough is what comes in my mind at this point. So, yeah, the better you want to score, the better your response is expected to be. And the better you'd want to score, the more of efforts in the right direction, of course, you're expected to put. The next one, the frequency of testing over time is stated and matches the demand of the question, plus the use of the same questionnaire and co-coder for the interpretation. Co-coder is the colleague that we had spoken about, and co-coder for the interpretation is given full stop, which is good. Irrelevant material is included about emailing the participants. Now, again, I'd like to highlight this in purple here. Irrelevant material is included about emailing the participants. This is not credited, but also does not result in lower marks. This is something that I mentioned earlier as well. So let's not do it if you're not getting marks on it. Every minute counts. This is not required, as the question states that Dr. Felix contacted them by telephone, and the rubric clearly stated, did not describe how Dr. Felix would recontact the participants. So what's done is done. Let's move on to the 12th point here. Several control or standardization measures were described. Several control or standardization measures were described, including the testing at fixed intervals, that is yearly, maintaining records to identify each participant, that is maintaining confidentiality. These are the things that I kept on speaking about, kept on referring to when we were discussing this. The use of the same colleague to help with the analysis of the qualitative data, plus strategies such as word list to help improve consistency between them. Just in case if you now strategy as the word list to help improve consistency, this is what we're talking about. These word list, right? Now, yeah, plus strategies such as word list to help improve consistency between them. Also, the instruction of participants to spend no more than 15 minutes would act as a standard feature. So while reading, there would be a lot of things that you must have just read. Even when I tried uh, commenting on almost every single line, but yeah, there might have been many things that you probably did not even think of that would affect the score the a particular response receives. Remember, you're graded through what you write on the script. The examiner cannot come and read your mind. The examiner certainly cannot come and read your mind. Whatever you have in your mind, whatever is appropriate to a particular question, you might as well put it down on paper. Do not assume you just vaguely put up anything and the examiner would mark you, giving you benefit of doubt. Not that they don't, but that's something that I'd want to speak about at a later occasion. But remember clarity. The more clear your response is, the better understanding the examiner would have. And I'm sure quite a few of you would probably not even have thought of all of this adding up to the response getting the mark that the response has received. So the response meets the requirement for level 5 test level. All required features are described in detail. Check. Showing good application to the situation and methodological knowledge. Check. The only thing that stops it from being awarded full marks is the lack of detail. Yes, lack of detail. There should have been more of detail. This is what the examiner thinks or feels about this. So, and there have been students who would be like, sir, what more? What more do we do? Practice more, write more, right? The more you write and the more correct information you write, the better chances you hold of getting a better grade. So, and all of this is only possible through practice. The first year you might, I mean, the first attempt, you'd probably take an hour and a half, a good hour and a half when you're attempting a question. The next might not take that long. The third one, I mean, the more you, I've said this twice at least, the more you put your pen to paper, the better you'd keep on getting, right? So the only thing that stops it from being awarded full marks is the lack of detail about rating scale used by participants when answering questions. And there could have been more detail or examples of questions. Now, this was a response that received 9 out of 10 marks, and I hope quite a lot about designing a study question or planning a study question has been covered for today. Something that I'd like adding up, which I felt was essential. Many of you have probably been uh, under the impression that for designing a study question, the only thing that is required is, I mean, I say I say what I'm saying because I've heard many students come up to me and say this. Many students have been under the impression that there are 5 different important components that every student gets graded on, and they are what, how, where, who, and when. And the descriptions of they mention there, you might as well read them. What being what the participants have to do, how being how will the outcome be measured or the procedure of study, where the location, the description, who, the sampling technique, number of participants, demographic details, etc. When, duration of study, time of the day, where the first two have been always seen as major components and the latter three have been seen as the minor components. How true is this is a question that many students come up with. How true is this that this is what actually needs to be done? You know what? A couple of years back, this is exactly what the CI marking schemes would be looking for. But over these years, this has changed. Not that this is not important today. If you, in a way, if you have a look at what we've just discussed, was somewhat revolving around this only. But gone are the days when the examiner would specifically mention that the examiner is looking for what, who, what, where, when, and how. So yeah, let's focus on what the examiner has been uh, what the examiner has been demanding now. So the new requirement is there are certain features that are present for every research method that I've shown you a couple of times so far. And these are the essential features that are to be catered and the details. And through this particular response, I tried explaining a lot more to you all as well. I'd like to wrap this up over here. I'd like to break this into parts so that you all do not, so that you're all able to absorb the information that I have tried to provide. In the next, I'd like to discuss middle great response with you all as well. And then we discuss the examiner comments to it and the common mistakes made. These are some common words that I believe every student should know when you're going to sit for your examination, because these are the words, these are the command words that you typically come across. Then I have a couple of examples of questions that have been picked up from past papers that include correlational study, because of course the specimen paper for now has a longitudinal study, a question on longitudinal study, but nonetheless, to be able to practice, I mean, I kept on saying you put your pen to paper. I kept on saying you you keep on practicing. You ought to have more of questions so that you're able to practice. You could, this is hopefully I'd be able to uh, spare some time to be able to help you all through this. So these are a couple of questions that could be put to use as well. Uh, yeah, so a structured interview questionnaires, laboratory experiment, just in case if anyone wants to take a screenshot right away or pause it right away and give it a read. Then we have it for case studies, followed by field experiments. So yeah, the major characteristics of research methods. I had mentioned that there's a 4-mark question that follows this 10-mark question as well. Hopefully, I'd be able to spare some time to be able to do that as well. I hope this has been helpful. Take good care of yourselves. Stay happy, healthy, safe, and protected. Stay humble, spread positivity, spread smiles, and Allah Hafiz.